So the way that the WTO started was after World War II. And after World War II, we had the Bretton Woods institutions formed, including the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and we also had the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, known as GATT. So after the war, what everybody needed more or less was economic development. And there were a lot of countries that had set fairly high tariffs. So back then the formula looked pretty easy. You didn't have to be a genius to figure it out. If you lower the tariffs, trade increases. If trade increases, then overall wealth increases. So that worked for a while, and the GATT was hugely successful for quite a few decades. So if you look at the first few rounds of negotiations, the membership of the GATT increased incrementally. So it moved from 19 to 27, 33, etc. And what's remarkable is that even during the 60s, 70s, 80s, its membership was increasing very rapidly. Now that world back then was clearly divided by the Cold War into the Soviet camp and the Western pro-US camp. So the fact that the GATT could bring them together was pretty much on its own pretty extraordinary. Now, in the mid-90s, the GATT transformed into a new organization, and this is what we have today as the WTO. And the WTO, as of today, has 164 member states. Now, after this transformation, one of the big changes that happened was that the negotiations became much more complex. So since the transformation of GATT into the WTO, we really haven't had a big successful round of negotiations. So the last one started in Doha, that's in Qatar in the Middle East, in 2001. And what happened was it kept going for about 10 years, more or less. And if you look it up back in the media, you're going to see plenty of articles written about it, and they really tried to push it. But it was clearly becoming increasingly hard to decide on anything. Now, there are a few reasons for that. One of the reasons is that you have a lot more member countries. So agreeing on something with, for instance, 74 members or 85 members is much easier than agreeing on something with 164 members. Another reason is that the formula for growth that we saw during this period, meaning lower tariffs, increase trade, make money, doesn't work as well anymore. So we already lowered the tariffs, and that formula is not as easy to apply as it used to be. So the WTO is, according to quite a few people, in a little bit of a stalemate. However, it's still very, very relevant. And if you also look at China's development, one of the big booms in terms of trade came after China joined the WTO. Especially if you look at regions where China didn't engage as much. For instance, if you look at China, Latin America, the China-Latin America relationship picked up really after China joined the WTO, because it also joined a common set of standards, tariff agreements, etc. So, what does the WTO do? Well, if you ask different people, usually they give you very different answers. So if you ask, for instance, a lawyer, an international lawyer, they might focus exclusively on the disputes that it solves. Or if you focus on a journalist, they might talk to you about the negotiations that take place there. But in fact, it has 4 functions, and all of them are equally important. So the first function of the WTO is negotiations. What it does is it brings countries together, and everything there is agreed by consensus. That's one of the reasons why the Doha round of negotiations hasn't yet worked out properly, because you need consensus by a large number of countries. This approach has, in the past decades, led to 2 huge implications in terms of results. The first one is now we have a rule-based system for trade, and the second one is that we have gradually lowered trade barriers quite significantly. Now, the second function of the WTO is implementation of these regulations. So if you look at what it does on a day-to-day basis, you can openly look at the WTO schedule on their website, at least for some of their committees. What you're going to see is that they have lots of meetings and discussion. They have hierarchies of committees, so they have committees that are higher up the chain and lower down the chain. And they do a lot of monitoring as well to see if the regulations are being complied with. The third function that the WTO has, and perhaps one of its most famous ones, is settling disputes or litigation. And it has 2 rounds of dispute settlement. In the first ruling, there are panels of judges that make a decision, and then there is also a second ruling, so every country can appeal after there is a decision taken against it. So disputes is what the WTO is perhaps most known for by the general public. And then finally, the WTO places some focus on development. It's not a development-focused organization per se, but it does have more lenient rules for developing countries. So when you hear things about the status of certain countries, including the status of China in the international society, is it a developed country or a developing country? And you're going to hear the same question over and over in the next few years. Once you get the Indian economy growing, once you get the Brazilian economy growing, are they developing countries or developed countries? Now that question is not just a theoretical question that you see in the classroom or that we discuss for fun. It's a question that has real implications in terms of the tariffs that they can put on products from different countries, because the WTO treats developing and developed countries differently. So what the WTO has is rules, and they are around 500 pages, and they're much clearer than anything, any of the other documents that you're going to find from the WTO. They cover all kinds of different areas in terms of products, imports, exports, intellectual property, anti-dumping regulations, so they make sure that no country just dumps large quantities of its products elsewhere. Areas like finance, etc. And you also have WTO terms, and this is a huge base of lists of commitments by different countries, and what they focus mostly on, but not exclusively, is tariff ceilings. So they have certain numbers that tariffs cannot go higher than. So essentially they set a limit on the tariffs that countries can put on certain products. Now the WTO is famous for some of its articles more than others, and the first one, which is the core principle of the WTO, is the MFN, or the most favored nation principle. So that principle states that countries cannot normally discriminate between their trading partners. And if you look at the GATT agreement, that was Article 1. If you look at the GATS agreement, that's Article 2. So this is a principle that's fundamental to the functions of the WTO. And if you look at Article 24, what you're going to see is how countries can end up signing free trade agreements and moving around the MFN if they wish to. So Article 24 states that countries can sign free trade agreements with each other as long as they comply with WTO requirements. And they're usually both members of the WTO. And it's also important that WTO covers a compatibility of standards and regulations. There is a long list of core principles by the WTO, and all of them are covered in a number of books that are easily accessible for anyone that's interested. Now, on a more practical level, what the WTO did is they introduced a harmonized tariff code for products. So anyone who wants to do import and export essentially must understand how the tariff code works. So every product in the world, doesn't matter what the product is, it could be a cell phone, it could be a bottle of water, it's classified into a certain type of product, and it has a certain code. Now, this code has 6 digits. The first 2 digits are a rough indication of the product, and they refer usually to a chapter of classification. The following 2 digits identify the product category, and the final 2 digits refer to the specific qualities of the product. So if you look at, for instance, a list of codes, what you're going to find is that you can take any kind of a product and trace its code down to the WTO classification. Now with these codes, and that's going to open perhaps in a minute, what you can do is you can check what the tariffs are in each country for each product. So say if you want to start exporting bags, instead of checking bags and checking them one by one for each country and wondering how you say that in different languages, you can check the code for the bags. And then with that code, you can find what the tariff is in each country for different, for that same type of bag. So these codes are absolutely necessary if you're interested in doing any kind of international trade, and you should check them out.